Welcome to today's WNBA Author Talk. My name is Julie Frey, and I'm a member of the Women's National Book Association's Greater Philadelphia chapter, and I serve as the WNBA's Communications and Events Chair. Our co-host today is Jennifer Holmes, a member of our LA chapter, and Jen serves as the moderator for the Bookwoman Book Club, which is dedicated to reading books from the Great Group Reads annual lists. Joining us today is Donna Hemans. Donna is the author of the novel River Woman, winner of the 2003 Towson University Prize for Literature, and Tea by the Sea, for which she won the Lignum Vitae Marson Award for Adult Literature. And that is her second novel. That is a mouthful. Donna has held multiple fellowships and residencies, including at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and Georgetown University. Her short fiction has appeared in Volume 1 Brooklyn, The Caribbean Writer, Crab Orchard Review, Witness, and the anthology Stories from Blue Latitudes, Caribbean Women Writers at Home and Abroad, among others. She received her undergraduate degree from Fordham University and an MFA from American University. Her book, Tea by the Sea, was chosen by WNBA for the 2020 Great Group Reads. A quick note, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to write any questions that you have in the Q&A. We'll check throughout the talk, and then at the end, there'll be a time for audience questions. Welcome, Donna. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
To begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Jamaican, and I have been living here in Maryland for quite a while. And I love to write. I, write fiction and nonfiction in, various other forms.
That's great. So you said you live in Maryland and you were raised in Jamaica. When did you emigrate to the United States?
Well, I left Jamaica when I was 16. And so I graduated from high school in Jamaica, came here, lived in New York for a while, went to undergrad in New York. And then there was a blizzard in '96, and I had enough of New York and snow, and I decided to head south. And but at the time, I was also looking for a creative writing program, and I got into the program at AU. And so that was just perfect timing.
Oh, that's great. How did you become a writer? Were you always a reader? Did you decide one day as a child, this is what I want to do? Or was it something that you found once you were in school?
Yeah, well, I was always a reader. I don't think I ever really thought about being a writer. I mean, as a child, I certainly wrote a lot. If there was some kind of a, writing competition, I wrote. But it just never really occurred to me at that point that writing as a career was possible. And much later on, when I was actually an undergrad, I started, my initial plan when I, went to Fordham was to become a lawyer. And very quickly realized that that was not what I wanted to do. And so I made sure that my major was English and media studies. And so I started working for the school newspaper, and I took a fiction writing workshop, and I really liked it. So somewhere along the lines, I also read, I did a independent study with a professor who had me read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And when I read that book, it just opened up something in me. And I realized that what I wanted to do was write stories like that about my community in Jamaica, or, about Jamaica, about people and places that I grew up within and people I grew up knowing. And so that's where it really started for me. When I finished undergrad, I knew that the only other degree that I wanted to get was a creative writing degree. And so I moved on in that direction.
I think that's probably much more fun than writing briefs would have been.
I am pretty sure. I have read enough legal documents to know in my, in my adult, the regular work that I do, to know that I would not have any fun writing any of that kind of material.
I'm impressed that you can get through reading it. I have 2 sibling lawyers, and I don't want to read a thing that they write.
Well, thankfully, I don't actually have to read all the legal documents, but stuff that is close to it or even related to it, and it can be quite challenging.
What are some of the things that draws you to the various forms that you've used storytelling through your journalism and through your creative writing? What do you love about the storytelling form?
I think it gives you opportunities to learn about people without necessarily learning about people, if that makes sense. When you're writing fiction, you are, creating worlds that sometimes, like resemble the real world, but you're really learning about people as you're creating these worlds. You're drawing from the real world, you're drawing from your imagination. And somehow, once you start putting it all together, it really makes sense. And helps you to understand the world that, we're living in. And I think that's in some ways, one of the most interesting parts about writing fiction, that you can make up something, but it is the absolute truth. And in some ways, it can tell you a lot more about life and about people than, even reading nonfiction.
I agree. The amount of empathy that reading fiction can exude is just staggering at times. Seeing it change lives and people's perceptions and opening new worlds is a beautiful gift that the medium gives us.
Right.
Yep.
In your early days of writing, you said you did journalism. What kind of journalism did you do?
As a business journalist, I wrote for a couple of wire services and and newsletters. The worst one that I think I ever wrote for a very brief period was a newsletter on the um, what do you call it? The industry, the not mortuaries, but pretty close to that. The about
Oh.
Yeah, so it was about caskets and stuff like
Yeah, so funeral kind of stuff.
that. Yeah,
Oh, geez.
I did not last very long. Yeah, and it's interesting because there is a business side to all of this stuff that we don't think about. But that was not for me.
It's good to try things and make that decision then you can say I tried it, it wasn't for me. It's like food, right?
Exactly.
Because you have the business writing and had the journalism in your wheel bag, when you are working on those kind of pieces, but then switching to do creative writing, possibly in your spare time or when you carve out that time for it, is it an easy switch for you mentally, or is it difficult?
No, it's an easy switch. I think I've had to figure out how to compartmentalize each part of my life. And, I think when I first, like certainly when I was in grad school and I was switching from, like writing primarily, like for the wire service, I remember my first, one of the classes I took, I had to write like a paper after not writing papers for maybe 3-4 years. And, after leaving undergrad, I worked and I hadn't written an academic paper. And the first one I wrote, I remember the professor asking me, if I'd been a journalist. And I said, yes. And she said, well, your paragraphs are too short. You need to be longer. And, it was not something that I had ever really thought about. I thought I was putting the right information in but, not really thinking about the fact that, academic writing uses longer paragraphs. I just never thought about it. And I think after that, I became a little bit more conscious of what I was writing and how I was switching or moving between the two worlds. One of the other things that I think, certainly with my journalism career that has influenced my fiction writing is that, like certainly as a journalist, I had to, or at least working for a wire service, we were trying to write stories because, we were looking at and measuring our progress by the second or the millisecond or the whatever it is, because like it's the time that matters. Like certainly when you're talking about stocks, like how quickly you can get the news out matters. And so I found that I tend to write shorter, and I tend to just simply get into the story immediately. And that's one of the things I've heard from readers. Like, I don't give them any build up. It's just, I move in, you're there. And I like that because I think that sometimes you just simply need to get to the point. So that's one of those things that I learned from journalism that I think has filtered into fiction writing. And I don't know if at some point I'll be able to move away from that and start writing the beginning of a story a little bit more leisurely. But just get in, get to the point.
No,
And
that's your style, and that's okay.
I think that it lends itself very nicely to your tone and your voice.
Right.
I think I know personally I was able to get into the book and I stayed in the book,
Right.
and my mind didn't wander off thinking about, I mean, you gave lovely descriptions of places, but I didn't get lost in the description and my mind wander and create its own little journey.
Okay.
I stayed right with you, and so I really do appreciate your style.
Well, thank you. I'm glad.
I'd have to agree, because I always say that it usually takes me 3, 4, 5 chapters to really get into a book. So if I'm struggling, I just kind of push myself, that far, and I know eventually the plot's going to grab me. But I have to agree with you, Julie. It really, right from the beginning, you just feel like you're already plopped into the 3rd, 4th chapter.
Right. Oh, good. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Susan agrees. She says, I like getting in and then get in later and then move out early. So she likes to get in there and go. So, as a writer, when you start working on a piece and then you get into it and you're doing your revisions, at what point do you feel like your story has gotten to a point where you're ready to share it? Not necessarily publish it, but share it.
That depends. I think sometimes I will share early pieces of it. But, I think for me, because of the way I write, I sometimes will just simply have maybe 100 pages where I have bits and pieces of it, and I know that I have the basic timeline. I have a sense of where the story is going, but I don't necessarily know what pieces are missing. So every now and then, I will probably share a portion of that, not the entire thing, but if there's a specific part that I really need help on, or I really need to have an independent, like somebody looking at it independently to give me a sense of whether something is working, then yes, I will ask for that. And I have a group of friends who are fiction writers as well, who I rely on. And, I know that I will get good feedback, and I will get the kind of feedback that, it certainly helps me to figure out what is not working or why it's not working. And I certainly can use that to help me to move forward. But, certainly there's also a danger of sharing too early, of having somebody, depending if you're not sharing with the right reader, having somebody tell you something that throws your story off completely, or makes you start thinking about things that you don't necessarily need to fix. And you might end up with a story completely different from whatever it is that you started out with or wanted to do.
I think that's very wise advice you just shared with a lot of our writers on here. Be careful who you share with.
Yes, be very careful.
How did you find your writers group?
How did I find these women? I actually went to, they were meeting, there were, right now there's three of us, the core group, 3 of us. And when I met them, they had already been meeting, and they had gone to the same creative writing program. And I actually was at a reading, and they saw me, knew I was local, and asked me if I wanted to join their group. And I said, oh, sure, I'm looking for a group. So, I went along with them, and we've stayed together for probably close to 15, 20 years.
Wow.
That's fantastic.
It's a long time, yeah.
That's at that point, at some point early on, there must have been a point where you're like, these are my people, they're gonna help me through this. And did you have any idea a relationship would last at least this long?
No, I didn't. And it's a blessing. I think in a lot of ways we have shifted away from, the way how we started. Because initially we were, meeting every month or every 2 months, and making sure that somebody had work to share. And then we, gradually morphed into, well, let's go to this city and spend a day. And, I'd wander around Richmond. And, so we have had our moments of just sitting around and having brunch. And so I think it has just gradually grown into what we need. where, we're each working on longer projects. So we don't necessarily need to share something monthly. But, when one of us has finished, like a full length novel, we know that somebody within the group will be able to read it. And usually if I write an essay and I'm really not sure about it, that's, like one of the things. Is this an essay? Can you read this for me? I mean, what is missing? And I think just in having those kinds of conversations, sometimes I realize that what I thought was the focus of that essay, it's something completely different. And by having that conversation, I sometimes just am able to figure it out and move forward.
So many careers, people are in a position and for a certain amount of time, but then they move on, they lose touch with the contacts and people that might have been their not advisors, but like people they could bounce ideas off of during their positions. And I think one of the beauties of writing is that there's so much community built into this isolated act. If you have that community, it can be such a beautiful, supportive environment that helps you grow. And in your case, these women have seen you start early on in your career and grow as a writer, and having that relationship, I would think helps your work as well as your mental process throughout all the different stages of the book.
It certainly does. And even if all that you're talking about is like how horribly your writing is going, or the process of finding an agent, or whatever it is, sometimes it's just nice to have other people who know and understand what you're going through to talk about this lovely industry of ours.
Yeah. You published your first book in 2002, and then you published Tea by the Sea last year in 2020. So in that amount of time, the publishing industry has changed so much, and navigating the differences between probably you had different publishers and different experiences was probably difficult at times. What were some of the biggest differences you found?
Well, social media. That's the biggest thing, just because I remember in 2002, there are some writers who had websites, but it took me a while to actually build a website and to decide that this was something that I needed to do. And now, even before you've finished a book, you need to have a website, you need to have some kind of presence on social media. So that was the biggest change. But I think also that even though, it's a big change, but it's, in some ways, it's a blessing to have social media, because you can reach your audience in a way that, I certainly had not been able to do in 2002. I can have a direct conversations with people. And, 2020 was also just such a much different year. It introduced a whole nother level to this whole business of reaching people, where, we're doing everything, or had to pivot to doing everything online. Mm-hmm. And so, who knows, what I'm trying to see what will be the difference, in another 10 years, in another 15, 20 years, what else will we add? What have we learned from 2020 that will remain with us? Mm-hmm. How many people will continue to do online events, a year from now? I think we've all, been cooped up for so long that I think, maybe, as soon as we can, people will start rushing back out. But at the same time, there's also something appealing about being able to reach so many people, a wide range of people, through your screens. So it's interesting. I'm fascinated by what people have done over the last few years, and I'm curious to see what else, we come up with.
That's the thing with technology becoming so integral to our lives. 1 minute, a certain social media platform's the go-to for a certain group, and the next minute there's something else. And if you had to add things like an email list or, appearances in different places, it just adds up to so much time-consuming stuff where you're not actually writing. Does that frustrate you? Or is it just part of the gig?
No, it's just part of it. And I think at least this time around, I had built in time to allow myself to do a lot of these things, because I knew I had to do it. But it can be time consuming, especially if you're in the midst of a project, or you're starting a new project and that is what you want to spend your time on. But I think, I read something just this week, and I don't remember where it was, probably on social media. And I think there was a writer who was basically saying, budget a small amount of time each week for these other activities. And I think it makes sense. If you have the luxury of just simply doing your email or the administrative type things related to writing on one day out of the week, I think it certainly will allow you to spend more time, or as much time as you can, on the writing piece as opposed to the administrative work.
Has the pandemic changed the way you write and budget your time?
I maybe in some ways. I don't know if I can blame the pandemic for everything, but I will. In some ways, yes. I think last year, for part of the year, it was just really hard to write anything, and or write anything longer. I was able to finish a bunch of pieces and work on smaller, like small essays or smaller essays, but to really concentrate on a big, long work, that was a little bit harder. But at the same time, having just finished a book and getting ready to launch a book, I think I needed that downtime anyway, so I can't necessarily say that it was the pandemic. It was probably just a natural break in my writing process.
That you've recovered and you're writing now?
I am writing now. I finished, my third book is finished, and that I spent some time last year. It had been finished before. I was tweaking and twiddling and fixing things that, needed to be fixed. So at least I can say I finished that. I don't know how much of the work of finishing it actually really took place last year. And some of it was just there, but needed to be, like sharpened or brought out a little bit. But I am beginning to work on something else. There's some of it on paper and some of it is still in my head, and I need to just make the time and sit down and work on it.
I know some authors were saying they, have all this time, everybody's at home, but they just were lacking the creativity. And I know even as a reader, it's like, oh my gosh, this is our time to be home and do nothing but read. But so many people were just overwhelmed and distracted. And even though we finally had the time to do it, I think everything going around really stalled that for us. Did you notice that at all with yourself?
Yeah, I couldn't read a book for months. I think it was probably not before the summer or maybe early fall that I really got back into sitting down and reading.
Yeah.
And but now I think I've got back into that place where I am reading. I'm buying books. I'm looking again at stuff that like is interesting to me. Right. But yes, it certainly took a while, a very long while, to be able to concentrate.
What are some of the things you like to read?
I've been reading a lot of Caribbean authors. There were a number of books that came out last year from writers based in the Caribbean or outside of the Caribbean. So I've been reading or trying to read a lot more of those and trying to catch up on a lot of other books that I just hadn't read. The last book I finished just recently was The Shadow King by Mazza Mengiste, I think her last name. Yeah, I think that's what you say. And I really love that book. And and that was a hefty book. So I was happy to be able to get through, like something as thick as that. Because I was uncertain whether I was ready for something, like for a big book. But it was it was beautifully done, and I really loved the story.
Okay, I'll have to check that out. Thank you for the recommendation.
Sure.
For those who are unfamiliar with your early work, can you tell us a little bit about River Woman and what it's about and how you came to write it?
Well, that one is set in Jamaica as well, and it's a story about a young mother whose child drowns, and about how the mother and the community deal with the death of the child. And one of the things that book goes into is, the piece of it, a large portion of it really is about immigration and what happens when a parent leaves their child behind, migrates alone and leaves the child behind. And so the young mother whose child drowns, her mother had left her in Jamaica, I think when she was about 3 or 4 years old. and had not come back to Jamaica. And each year her mother kept saying, soon, soon, I'll come back and get you. And that connection just never happened. So it's a story that I started writing because at the time, around that time, there was a friend of mine who had her child in Jamaica. And, one of the questions that I had, and her child at that time was about 3 years old too. And one of the questions that I had was, whether or not a child at that age is, understands why mommy isn't here, why daddy isn't here. And, what would that process be like for that child once they reunited? So that was the kind of exploration that I wanted to, what kind of topic I wanted to explore. I wanted to really look at, like what happens to the people who are left behind when somebody migrates.
Mm-hmm. I sent, there was, between both of your books, you deal with big themes. Loss is a big one. Belonging is another one. Identity, figuring out agency, individual agency. What draws you to such big, deep, universal themes that we can all relate to?
I am not sure exactly what draws me to them, but I keep coming back to some of them. But I think, for all of us, and I know for me as an immigrant, I mean, there's always a big question of where do you belong? Where is home? And when you leave one place and you go to another place, is that original home still there for you? How do you make your way in this other new place? And so those are questions that I think will always show up in my work. And I feel in some ways that's one of the things I'm always writing about is, belonging, building that sense of belonging, getting that sense of belonging, and finding that place where that is yours, where you truly belong and where you truly can thrive. So some of the other issues I think just come up because, belonging and home certainly is also in the book that I just finished writing, big theme there as well. Motherhood is also another issue. And I wrote an essay it was published late last year where I, was looking at, that whole sense about why I'm always writing about some things like the whole thing with belonging and also with motherhood. And I remember, having a conversation with my mother and, she was telling me that, she didn't grow up with her mother and she hadn't met her mother until she was, I think, about 12 years old. And, it was just one of those things that stayed with me in some ways. And so I feel that unconsciously, I'm probably writing her story or reaching back in some way, somehow that probably has filtered into my life. And I'm continuing to write that story or in some ways trying to figure out and trying to understand that. So I think all of these issues are there in some ways in our lives. I think for most writers, the issues, the things that we write about and we come back to, I think are there. We might not necessarily be consciously thinking about it, but it bubbles up in our writing some way, shape, or form. And so I think that's what it is for me.
I think that's beautiful. I can't wait to see what you produce next. So for those who haven't read Tea by the Sea, could you just give us a brief synopsis and then we'll start asking you some questions about Tea by the Sea?
Sure. So Tea by the Sea is a story about a mother who is searching for her child who was taken from her at birth. And so when the story opens, we meet Lenwar, the child's father, as he is scurrying away with this newborn baby who he has taken from the hospital. And then we meet Plum as she's beginning to discover that her child is gone. And her search takes 17 years. So she is moving back between Jamaica and Brooklyn as she continues to search for her child.
It's a beautiful book, by the way. Everyone should read it if you haven't already. But Jen, if you want to take it away.
Yes, I'm ready. All right, so here's some questions that we came up with our book discussion and just a few extra that I personally wanted to know. So someone brought up about how the book starts with Lenwar's story and not with Plum. Is that intentional?
Yes, that's intentional. I will say when I initially wrote the book, I had a completely different, it began somewhere else. It began at the moment where Plum is leaving her house to go to the church. And she knows she's not leaving that church. And so I think in the process of revising, I realized that I had to begin the story earlier. And I knew that I wanted to begin with something momentous. And that momentous moment would have been Lenwar walking away with that child. And I thought that I needed to set that scene before introducing Plum, before showing her grief and showing her searching. So I think I had to begin with him as opposed to beginning with her.
We all agreed the writing is just so beautiful, and we loved just the poetic reference of her mother being a bird. What made you think of that?
I don't remember. I think there is a folk tale about a woman who is a bird, and I can't remember the details of it, but I have this vague recollection in my head that as a child I read a book with a woman who was a bird. And I'm sure that there are probably lots of those stories, but I don't think I was ever able to find that story, but I just always thought that there was something in the back of my mind that there was a story about a woman who was a bird. So
it's a beautiful way to tell a child, that their mother, and obviously it wasn't true that she had died, but what a beautiful reference to, have in her mind of what actually happened to her mother.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it certainly was. I mean, Lenwar is a special character. But yeah, I mean, with his flaws and all, that really was it certainly was an interesting way to explain it to a child.
Okay, why don't the police go looking for Lenwar after he kidnaps the baby?
Lots of things happen in Jamaica that we can't explain. And even to this day, I think there's so many things that happen that you go to the authorities and you expect to get some help, and you don't necessarily get the help that you want or you expect, and it's what happens. But I don't think, or I didn't think that at that time that they certainly would have gone. One, Plum she was a young woman, and she was really, struggling with the loss. And she went to lots of different places, but there's also information that she began to realize she didn't know about Lenwar. She didn't know exactly where he came from. And there were just some other details she didn't know. So I think it would have been hard, even if the police would be ready to help, it would be hard to figure out who exactly he was and where he came from. And I think for her, she was also just, like in the immediate moment, the loss was just so great. It just wasn't at the forefront of her mind to pursue it from that angle.
Right, because not only did he take her baby, but he essentially had a relationship with a girl that was underage. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know if that's something, would that have been something that the authorities would have went after him?
At that time period in Jamaica, I don't know that I would say yes, they would have. Okay. I think, certainly if something like that happened now, I think it's a whole different attitude than, let's say if you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years ago. But at the same time, she was, her parents also didn't do anything, because her parents didn't come back. And the aunt who she was living with kicked her out of the house, because at that point she was now an adult. So would they really have pursued it at that point? I don't think so. Not based on what I know and understand about how the police operated then.
Well, and that's kind of one of my other questions. Why were her parents so indifferent of the loss of her first and only grandchild? I mean, they just were so against her having the baby that they didn't care that the baby was gone, or?
Yeah, I think they realized that in some ways, I don't know that I would say they didn't care, but I think for them it was more that she still had to get on with her life. That you can have something horrible happen to you, but you can still move on from that, whatever that thing is. You can move on. You can build a life. You can have a life. And so I think that's what the parents were looking for and wanting for her to, like, still move forward, grow, live, and follow up with that after or in addition to.
Now, when her parents find out about the baby, they decide not to come to her graduation and they cancel her ticket. Why didn't she just stay in Jamaica and search for the baby there instead of going back home?
Because her landlord, at that time, it was her landlord who was the one who pushed her to, like, to go back and to go to college and build her life. And the landlord said, if you do this, if you get your life together, if you continue on that path, I will have my son look for the child for you. And, it was a bargain that she struck, and she went on with it and moved on. And I think in the end, it worked out for her because there was not much that she could have done at that point. She didn't know exactly where to look, or she went to the places that she thought he lived, and she kept coming up empty. And so I think, based on the state of mind that she was in, I think she would have just continued to spiral downwards rather than, figuring out a way out of it.
In the group, we were mixed between people who thought that Lenwar did the right thing and other people that absolutely hated him. So this next question was, does the writer expect the reader to empathize with a teacher who has taken advantage of his 17-year-old student?
I don't expect it, but I still do believe that sometimes our intentions might be good. The way in which we carry out something might not necessarily be the best. And I think in some ways that Lenwar really thought he was doing something good. He wanted her to have a life. He wanted her to not be saddled and burdened with a baby at a young age. That was his rationale. So I really like to look at, to think of people as good. And if you look at it that way, it might help you to understand a little bit more of where somebody's coming from. You might not empathize, but I think you might understand, or I hope that there is some understanding. You might not agree either with what the person has done, but right. I hope that if we at least understand a little bit of where somebody's coming from, it might help us.
Now, Plum never told Alan about the baby or Lenwar, and he seemed like he just adored her. He loved her so much that, the feeling is that he would have, helped her emotionally. He probably would have helped her to try to, search for her himself. Why didn't she ever tell him?
Yeah, I think, he really loved her and he wanted the best for her. But I think with Plum, that, when her parents sent her to Jamaica and she felt that they had abandoned her. And then Lenwar takes off with her child and leaves her alone, and she feels that he has abandoned her. And I think in some ways that she felt that Alan would also abandon her. And I think it was just, she was protecting herself because she didn't know what else she was going to lose. And I'm not sure she could have stood to lose something else. And so I think for her, it was just protection.
Do you think she
kind of says that?
Sorry. I was just saying, do you think that she did come to love him?
I think she did. I think so. Or even if it wasn't love, I think she just accepted that, she had to move on, that there was somebody there and he would have done anything for her. So I hope she loved him.
Well, and she basically tells him, that she just can't trust. So right. It makes a lot of sense what you're saying. She doesn't have anyone or doesn't have an example of anyone that's been in her life and close to her that she can trust. So, she can't tell him this and trust that he'll stay with her, because she's probably a little, shamed at what took place, because that's basically how her family has made her, to feel.
Right.
So it probably eventually she just figured she just has to give up the search. And here's this person who has proven, for this period of time that he loves her and he's trustworthy. And therefore she decided to be with him.
Right. Yeah.
Why didn't Lenwar have a relationship with his mother? I mean, he basically goes and tells her that he's going to have a baby, but never speaks to her after that. Was he hiding something, or he just wasn't close to her?
I think for him, I think it was I think more a combination of being ashamed, because he initially had planned to go back and take the child back. But, once you have gone off and you've kidnapped the child and run off with the child and you've gone into hiding, I think it's just a difficult thing to go back home and pretend that everything is normal. And I think, with him, once he moved off and went to Anchovy, he knew he would not be found, or he did not expect to be found at all. But, if in some way, shape, or form, like Plum had figured out where he came from and where his mother was, then that would be somebody else who would be able to tell his story or would be able to explain where he is. And I don't think he wanted to run that risk at all.
Yeah. You touch on briefly on the scandal with the young girl at the school. He quits his job there, but did anything actually happen between the two? Or is it just, a coincidence that something came up with another young girl that he was tutoring?
Yeah, I wanted it to read as coincidence. I didn't want him to, I didn't want to paint him as a pedophile. I knew I was veering into that territory. And at one point I was a little bit worried, when, like I started describing Opal as, resembling resembling her mother, I was a little bit worried about, like if I was veering too close into some other territory. So yeah, I didn't want him to, my intention was not to portray him as a pedophile, but really to concentrate on the other aspects of his life, on the other aspects of the things that the other lies he told, the other mistakes he made, as opposed to, that portion of it.
Well, and I think that was better too, because Lenwar actually did love Plum. So if he would have done this to another person, it would have been just the act of doing something, right, versus being with her. He did love her, and because he loved her, he thought he was doing the right thing,
right,
by taking the baby.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. As Opal grew older, Lenwar saw that she was in pain. She obviously was very quiet and withdrawn. Why didn't he decide at some point just to connect the two? I mean, Plum would have been older. She would have finished her school. She would have done everything that he actually wanted her to do. Why not at that point get the two together?
Because his entire life would come tumbling down. And I think for him at that point, it really was about self-preservation. He had created this life for himself. He had created this story, and things were going well. So yeah, I didn't think that he would have done anything that would have toppled that life. And, I don't want to talk about the end, but, one of the things you'll see is just simply how far a person will go to protect what they want to protect.
Yep. Did you put the death of the older woman in front of the church as a distraction so Lenwar wouldn't find Plum and Opal as early in the story?
Yeah, I needed to get them out of the church.
That's what we thought.
Just sacrifice some old woman.
Sorry, you have to die because we have to distract him.
I think,
do you have a backstory? Do you have backstories for all of your characters?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't remember. I think in another version, the woman had gone into the church. I'm trying to remember how I wrote it initially. So I think once I was in the editing phase or revision phase, I think I ended up putting her on the outside of the church. But yeah, in terms of backstories, no, I know there's some writers who have, like entire notebooks on a character's life, and I've just never been able to do it. I think through, like as I'm writing, I think through, well, would that person really do that? And if the person did X or Y, how would it change the story? But it's just hard enough for me to remember how old a person is, and I have those written down, like the ages and the dates and like little things like those, but not like full backstories.
What came first for you, the characters or the story, the plot?
With this one, it was the character came first. So I had some years back, I had written a little note to myself that I wanted to write something with a group of people, a group of strangers set in stuck in a church or locked in a church. And so after that, I started writing the section with the mother who, got her children ready to go to school, dropped them off, and instead of going down the stairs to the subway, she, left and went in the opposite direction and walked towards the church. And so I knew then that I had the person who was going to be in the church, but I didn't know why she was going to be there or why she was there and why she would refuse to leave. And I was trying to think it through and trying to figure out what like the story was about. And then I happened to be in Jamaica, and there's a radio program that comes on every Sunday evening called Sunday Contact, and I mention it in the book as well. And people call in to look for like people they've lost touch with. And that particular time when I was there, a woman called in looking for her son, who I believe was about 8 years old. And what she said was that the father had taken the child. And she didn't know where they were. Didn't know if they were in Jamaica, didn't know if they were here, or didn't know anything at all about it. And so once I heard it, I said, this is my story. This is the mother who's in that church. And she will not leave until she figures out where her child is. So once I had that, then I had to start building and fleshing out the story itself.
How long did it take you to write?
Probably 3 years or so. Between writing and revising, I would say about 3 years.
That's not that long.
Yeah. The book I just finished, I think I started in 2005. So yeah.
What inspired you to leave the ending open?
I don't know that I left it open. Well, I've heard lots of questions about the end. I want to think that it tells you exactly what happens. That's the way I read it, and I can't say too much, but I imagine everybody who's on the call has read it, or that's what I hope. Yeah. But the way in which I wrote it, I think that you have a sense of what happens. And I don't know, I kind of like readers to take that extra step. And to, I think I put enough clues there, or I hope I put enough clues there so that you know what that next step is. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I think we all discussed it, and it was, there was a mixed group of people who, like the little tide bow at the end and they just know, and the rest of us who thought it was, you kind of end your own ending to it. So we figure the way that it ends, we kind of know what happens next. But it did get a lot of people wanting me to ask you if you were going to write a sequel to this book to finish it off, because we all want to know.
Yeah, I've got that question too about the sequel, but I think I don't know. One of the things that I think when I set out to write this book, the question I was asking myself was, how far would a mother go to find her child? Yeah. And I think for me, I answered it. So I knew how far she would go. Yeah. And what I think for me in the end, the final image of, I think
at this point, I think everyone has who's still on the call has read it. So.
So for me, that final image of Plum running after, of Opal running after the car, Plum has got what she wants. She wanted her daughter, and her daughter is there. So I don't think of it in the same way as open-ended, because once she gets to the police station and she tells the story, Lenwar's life is just going to crumble. There is no way that he can continue with that life. And I don't think that Opal would ever go back to him. So for me, that's the way I read the end. I mean, mother and daughter reunited. So I'm not sure what the sequel would be. And then that would be another full-length book would be, but somebody else asked, I think at one point, would it be Opal's story then? Right. I mean, which, it certainly could be an interesting book by itself. And in some ways, I had wanted to write Opal's story into this book. And in the revision process, I realized that it wasn't her story at all. It was Plum's and Lenwar's story. And there was just not enough for her in order to write the story here. So it would have to be, I don't know, maybe 10 years later, this is, like Opal going to look for her father because she hasn't seen him in, I don't know, 10 years.
Well, we were trying to think about, why there's, when Lenworth goes out, when the police show up and basically says, he was the hostage, it's like, oh, just want to wring his neck. It just shows you to the very end, really, honestly, what kind of person he was. Like, he, at that point, still didn't do the right thing. But why didn't the police, listen to Opal or Plum or Pauline, who all could have said, no, she's not, the one at fault here, and stop them from taking her, which obviously the book would have had to end a little bit differently. But I mean, especially Pauline was trying to get rid of, Opal the whole time. She wanted to send her off to school. And so you think, if anything, she would say, no, it's not her, let her take her daughter.
Right. Yeah, I think it was, the children had called, the two boys had called.
Yes.
And I think when they called, the police were responding to that. And if you have, like a priest, walking out and saying, sure, it's them, not me, it's quite likely you're going to believe the priest. Yeah. And I think in a lot of cases that always happens. It's the, the person who is arrested is not often or not always in the immediate, immediate event, is not always the person who really needs to be. Right. So, but I think part of it too was, what I really wanted to show was that Lenworth would have done anything to save himself. And he did.
Yep, he did. So I was,
if I could interject just quickly.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was really cool was the way that I read about this. So you're gonna have to flesh this out. But I did read that that you used your grandparents' house.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The house is still in my family. It is still there, but my grandparents have passed on, and my father and his siblings are getting up there in age, and they keep, one of the questions that keeps coming up is, when are we going to sell this place? And so it's a house that it has been, my grandparents, I think, they built it, and so it's been, like in the family for, I don't know how many years, at least since somewhere in the 1930s, I believe. So, to lose it, and to lose the property, and to lose everything, I think is a significant thing. And I think when I decided to set the story there, I wanted to look at it as my way, in some ways, to preserve this house, preserve it in memory, to describe it, because I described it exactly as it looks. And so that's it for me. That's my way of preserving it. I don't know if there's some other way for me to hold on to it. But and I think when I started describing it the way Lenworth walks up to it and he sees this abandoned house, and the, grass is overgrown, there was a time when I went there, and that's exactly what it looked like, because no tenant, it has been rented on and off, and at that time there was no tenant living in it. And I just had that image in my head when I started writing about Lenwar's finding this place.
Thank you for sharing that piece of your history with us.
Thanks.
I think that's very cool when people write about their familiar places, their homes and things, when we get little Easter eggs about them. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I quickly just want to say, if anyone wants to ask a question, just please put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, Jen will keep asking. We're good.
Just a couple more. Yeah. So we were going to ask you if you came up with the name of the book or if it was something that from your publisher, but then I actually read on your Instagram that said that you write about water a lot because it's rejuvenating. And I noticed Tea by the Sea and Your River Woman both have water in the titles.
Yeah, but yeah, I did come up with a title. I had it written down, and after I started writing it, because I like to have titles early on, because the titles help me to shape and focus the story and figure out exactly where it's going. And so I decided that this book was going to be called Tea by the Sea. And then I had to figure out, well, why? How does the sea and tea fit into the story? And so as I started writing it, and I had that little moment where Lenwar and Opal were at school and they bonded over drinking tea, then it just naturally started flowing into the rest of the book. But yeah, I for some reason have been writing about water, and I actually had to change the title of the book I just finished, because it was called Voices from the Sea, and then I realized that nope, that's too similar to Tea by the Sea, so I had to drop that really quickly.
That would get us all excited, thinking that you wrote a sequel, and then you just
there's that too. There is that.
Now, what about the cover of the book? Did you decide that?
Yeah, actually, my editor had sent me some photos, as she said, to inspire, or the starting point to figure out what the cover would be. And I didn't love the ones that she sent me, and I went online and I searched and I saw this this picture, and I said, and I sent it to her, and I said, I have something like this in mind. And then a few weeks or months later, I got the proposed cover of the book, and there was a picture, and I was just very happy.
Yeah, it's very beautiful.
It is. And I think it works very well, because for Plum, her child is lost. Her child is gone, and she doesn't know what her child looks like. And and I think this is just a perfect image for that. With her back turned, and and she longs too. I mean, she knows something isn't quite right. She wants this mother that her father told her, had died. So it's perfect.
And I think that's so great that you just pointed out. I didn't even think about it, how basically her face is not showing, because if you read a book in your imagination, you think of what you think the character looks like. So if you get a book and it has, the picture on there, that's who you imagine. So this kind of lent to having your own imagination about what the characters look like.
Right, yeah.
Okay, my last question for you. How do you come up with the names of your characters for your books?
Sometimes I back in the days when we had phone books, I would open the phone book and start looking. Some of them are people who, sometimes I use names of people who I know. Sometimes I, just randomly come up with a name. Every now and then I will use, when I think about who I might want to quote unquote honor, I haven't used names of anybody I don't particularly like. But maybe if I'm writing about a really horrible character, that will be next. But no,
watch out, middle school bully.
They're generally people I either, I know somebody with that name, or I just randomly have found it somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you for answering all my questions.
Sure. Thank you.
I have one more. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the DC Writers Room?
Yeah, it's a lovely little space where it's basically a co-writing studio for writers, co-working studio for writers. You know, like members pay a fee and just come in anytime and use it, you know, like to write. So for me, it's been a blessing to be able to go there now when we're cooped up in our houses all this time. So sometimes I just need to escape and go somewhere else to work, and it's just a quiet room. I can't work in coffee shops. I just can't do that. There's just too much going on. And so the writer's room is just a really quiet space where you can write and just get work done without any distractions.
Was that your impetus for starting it? You needed a place to write?
No, actually, I bought it from another writer, and she had bought it from another writer. So, and you know, for me, I needed it at that point to really just to continue to have that place to go to write. I certainly can work, you know, like at home, and I do, but there are times when I just need to be somewhere else. There are times when, you know, I play tennis and I watch a lot of tennis, and US Open, Australian Open, all of those opens, I am glued to the TV and I know that I need to leave. I need to go somewhere else. So it's nice to have that place.
Were you staying up all night watching the Australian Open?
I set my alarm for 3 o'clock for the final. So
yep. I didn't do that this year, but I've done it before. Well, anyone who is a member of our DC chapter, please definitely go check out Donna's space, the DC Writers Room. And I can put a link actually in the chat for that.
Thank you.
Sure. We like to support what you do in all of your literary pursuits. Yeah. So there is a link to that. And I'm going to quickly put a link to Tea by the Sea. There you go. And then Donna, thank you so much. If you want to pop off, that's fine. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping with our members. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was lovely.
We really enjoyed it, and we enjoyed the book. So we will continue to share the love for the book and for you.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Take care. All right, so here we go. We're going to quickly pop up this screen. So that gives you the images and the titles for Donna's 2 books. And then if you want to learn more about Donna, there is her information. So you can check out her website or visit her on social media. Oh, and then I had put that in there, the DC Writers Room. So I'll stay on that for a second so everyone can get that information. And thank you guys for attending. We appreciate all of your support, and we hope that we'll see you at future events. If you haven't signed up for our events and opportunities newsletter, please go ahead and do so, because that's the best way to find out about what we have upcoming. We do also have an events calendar on our website, which you can see at this link where it says upcoming events. So you can check out and see what our various different chapters are doing, as well as what National is doing. So we hope to see you soon, and thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Jen. Bye.
Bye.